When we think of biodiversity, most of us probably think of the declining global populations of whales, apes, tigers, and birds, creatures that generally resemble us. But the invertebrates, insects, sea urchins, worms, weevils, and the like, those life forms constitute 97% of all animal species, a huge swatch of the great sacred web of life on Earth. One person who cares deeply about invertebrates is Robert Michael Pyle, who in 1971 created the Xerces Society. The Xerces Society is named for an extinct blue butterfly, and it's dedicated to the conservation of invertebrate life. Pyle is a lepidopterist, an expert on butterflies, but he's also a popular writer with numerous books to his credit. And he's an eloquent advocate for improbable forms of conservation, like advocacy for the damaged lands in Washington state where he lives, lands that have been ravaged by resource industries. He also worries about what he calls the extinction of experience, the decline of direct human contact with the natural world, which leads to the loss of our sensitivity to it. And he's a poet. That's where we started. So can I start by asking you to read your poem? That's probably not the sort of thing you normally have to do first thing in the morning, but if you don't mind, I'd be grateful.
It's a good way to start a day. Very often start the morning by reading poetry, someone else's, so quite happy to do that. This poem is published in the book Chinook and Chanterelle from Lost Horse Press. It's called Unwanted Creatures. It came about from an experience teaching with Barbara Kingsolver and Patty Ann Rogers at a nature writing retreat. Nature writing in the broadest sense of the word, writing that attended to more than strictly human beings. And this was held at a very nice ecological retreat in the Cascade Mountains of Washington. And there we saw a sign in our rooms. And the sign was intended, I'm sure, to be green and friendly and very gentle. But the sign said, "Yellow jackets are so numerous this year. Keeping the doors closed and screens down will help keep your meeting space free of these unwanted creatures." Now, there were a lot of wasps in the rooms, and they were a bit tedious, but they're not really going to hurt you if you don't hurt them. And something about the idea of keeping our windows and doors shut in this beautiful spring weather in the Cascades. And then I realized that wasn't really what bothered me about it. I was sitting down, and, I know, it was that phrase, unwanted creatures. There's something about that kind of stuck in my craw. So this poem came from that. Unwanted creatures. Like tigers in the grasses of the Bay of Bengal, having villagers for lunch. Like bats that flap into bedrooms, leaving rumors of rabies and garlic. Like wolves who snap up afterbirths, and sometimes even calves. Like caterpillars of cabbage whites, turning broccoli into lace. Like bison blamed for bovine TB, and beavers for giardia. Like goats in the Galapagos, and elephants in Maasai crops. The flicker hammering the roof at dawn, the mockingbird chattering the night away, the owl who calls your name at night, that raven on the bust of Pallas who makes it all too clear Lenore ain't coming back. Like starlings in the city park, spotted owls in old-growth woods, crows in the corn rows, even that nightingale in Berkeley Square must have pissed somebody off. Like ants in the pantry, bats in the belfry, bees in the bonnet, bulls in the china shop, fleas on the kitty, ticks on the pooch, squirrels in the attic, rats in the roof, slugs in the lettuce, crabs in the crotch, pumas in the playground, coyotes in the lambing fold, and snakes and spiders pretty much everywhere. Like prairie dogs digging up the open range, raccoons ransacking the trash, sea lions with a taste for salmon, rabbits at the carrot patch, bears at a picnic, chiggers in the grass, possums on the road, deer through the windshield, skunks on the auto grill, mosquitoes at the barbecue, clothes moths in your woolen socks, midges on the Scottish heath, black flies blotting out the midnight sun, maggots in the Granny Smith, roaches on the kitchen floor, lice in your daughter's hair, tapeworms in the gut, virus in the blood, like Jews on Kristallnacht, Palestinians on the Temple Mount, blacks on the schoolhouse steps, Indians in Dodge, Tutsis with the Hutus, Muslims with the Serbs, Catholics in Ulster, gays in Laramie, women to the Taliban, everyone to someone else, unwanted all. Be sure and keep the doors closed.
I love it. It's a lovely poem.
Thank you.
Well, I asked you to do that because it occurs to me that you've spent a lot of your life with creatures who maybe aren't unwanted. And I'm thinking of the butterflies, for example. But they're not creatures that other people have set out to conserve.
That's absolutely right.
And that started, from my understanding, with an encounter in Crested Butte, Colorado, when you were very young. Can we start with that encounter? Because that really shaped your life, didn't it?
Absolutely shaped my life in every way. Yes, I was living at the time. In fact, I lived all through my school years in Aurora, Colorado, a big suburb of Denver. At that time, a small town when we moved there in '52. But by the time I left there for college in '65, it was large, and now it's the tail wagging the dog, actually more populous than Denver. So the growth of the suburbs in this exoskeleton around Denver was immense, and I lived through that during my school years. It was not an unpleasant place to be in most respects, but it was a classic post-war subdivision, and so I relished every chance to get out into the countryside because I had a passion for nature at a very young age. It first expressed itself with mollusks, with seashells, which was a silly thing to do in Colorado. Bad place to be a kid concologist in Colorado. But finally, at the age of 11, my stepbrother, my parents had broken up very, very early, when I was 9, and my father remarried, and I acquired a stepbrother named Bruce Campbell, who said one day, "I'm going out to catch insects for a merit badge." He was doing scouts for a while. "Do you want to come to?" And I was just about that time saying, "The heck with these seashells, I'm going to do something that gives me a little more requited love here." I said, "Yeah, I'll go along. I'll do the butterflies." I was a bit interested in butterflies. I'd seen a few flitting and thought, those are cool. So I went, and Bruce quit the next day. He didn't really care for entomology, but that was the beginning for me. Now, that was the summer I turned 11, it would have been '58. But the next summer, the family, the recombined family, went to Crested Butte, Colorado, as it did for each summer after that, part of the summer, because my stepmother and her family had a cabin there. They were primarily Oklahoma people and Kansas people and Texas people. And a lot of folks from those states came to the Rockies in the summertime. But that was before the Colorado towns were swish and fancy and chic and expensive, except for Aspen was the only one then. So Crested Butte was a crusty, dusty old Slavic coal town, and the cabins were cheap. So people would come and have these summer cabins, mostly from the near south. And I hankered for any chance to get into the mountains because I lived on the wrong side of Denver for the mountains. I was a prairie kid. You live on the west side of Denver, you're a kid of the Rocky Mountains. You live on the east side, you're a kid of the Great Plains. And that was me, and I liked my prairie ditch and so on. But the mountains, that's where the butterflies were. So my father would go on occasional fishing trips, but they were just day trips. So to go up to Crested Butte in the West Elk Mountains, that first time in the summer of 1959, when I turned 12 years old, was absolute magic. Butterflies all around me. Well, I had been reading in F. Martin Brown's book, Colorado Butterflies, that my father had given me, in the Denver Museum of Natural History, all about these butterflies, and I was particularly intrigued by a black species, all black, called the Magdalena alpine. And it lived in the high rock slides, and it mentioned a location up some distance above Crested Butte, and I always wondered if I might be able to get up there, a place called Copper Creek. Well, it was a little too far from the village for me to get up there. My father, however, would fish up the meanders of the East River, going up out of Crested Butte toward a place called Gothic. In those days, he just had to talk to the rancher to fish in those beautiful serpentine loops of the river. Now, it's all a syndicate, and you pay $10,000 for a fishing fee for the year, that sort of thing. We went up there, and I would fish with him at first, but he did me the great favor of never teaching me fly fishing, because if he had, my life might have come out very, very different. I'd be maybe plowing the same turf as David James Duncan, but I never learned fly fishing, and I was bored with bait fishing. So I'd throw my spinner out a couple of times, and then when I didn't catch anything, I'd hope my dad wasn't watching, and I'd put it down, and I'd grab my butterfly net and go off into the meadows. That was my passion. And I think it was fine with him, really. He didn't have to worry about me. Then he got his solitude on the river, fly fishing. Well, this particular day of which you asked me, I was wandering up those meanders of the East River, and there was a little ridge, and I found my way over the ridge through the sage into the aspen and down the other side in pursuit of fritillary butterflies. And I looked down, and there was a meadow populated by what looked to me like about 100 people with butterfly nets. I'd never seen a single other person in the field with a butterfly net. So I was shocked. It might have been 20, but to me, in retrospect, it seems like a great passel. But it was a bunch. And I was a terribly shy kid. I was almost pathologically shy. But I overcame that, and I wandered down into the group and asked what was going on. And there were two older gentlemen in their 30s, both bearded, and one of them tall, ginger beard, big dome of a forehead, said, "Oh, I am Professor Remington of Yale, and this is Professor Ehrlich of Stanford, and we are here with our graduate students performing mark-release recapture studies on Spiraea mormonia." And I said, "Oh, the Mormon fritillary." "Well," he said, "oh, a 12-year-old who knows what this butterfly is." That caught his attention. Then I said, "Did you say you're Dr. Remington?" And he said, "Yes." And I said, "You started the Lepidopterist Society." So I knew that because I had joined the Lepidopterist Society the previous winter because I met a mentor, a rubber worker in Denver, a collector who turned me on to it. So I knew I was standing with the living gods of Lepidoptera, though they were young men. It was Remington who, after Guggenheim with Ford in Oxford, came back and really launched ecological genetics of Lepidoptera at Yale in this country and started the Lepidopterist Society with Harry Clinch. Paul Ehrlich, of course, we know from Population Bomb and everything that has come since. Paul did his PhD on butterflies also at the University of Kansas, who was a charter member of the Lepidopterist Society, has always been a great part of it. So the two of these, I already knew their names, and of course that flattered them no end. This kid comes out of the hills and knows who they are. And I think really recognizing enthusiasm in the young is a potent thing for any teacher. And so they took me under their wing. And for that summer and for the next 2 summers, the weeks that I was there, they entertained me in their cabins at Gothic. Now, Gothic was an old silver mining ghost town. You know, it wasn't a ghost town when it was silver mining. It was big, 5,000 people, but it quickly boomed after the silver crash, and it became a ghost town. And then that was discovered by some biologists in the 20s, and it became the first of the independent biological field stations in the country. Rocky Mountain Biological Station, Rocky Mountain Biological Laboratory is still there, and it's robust. It has a Remington laboratory now and an Ehrlich laboratory and so on. But it's still in the midst of this gorgeous high subalpine valley with Mount Gothic to one side, which has crockets and spires, hence its name. And then the Maroon Bells Wilderness off to the east. And that is where I really came to know the academic and scientific passion for butterflies I'd already discovered at the gut level and the aesthetic level as a kid. And they had me into their cabins anytime I could get up there. And they even, from time to time, drove down to Crested Butte, the 8 miles, to pick me up or to take me back at the end of the day. That was extraordinary. And then it took me afield a couple of times. And it was the last visit that summer. I believe I asked Dr. Remington if he knew about this place, Copper Creek, and this butterfly, the Magdalena alpine. He said, oh yes, my cabin is at the bottom of Copper Creek. Start the trail right there. It goes right up past Ehrlich's cabin, and then you're going up Copper Creek. And if you go far enough, you'll come to Copper Lake in the Arctic Alpine. There's a great rock slide by it, and that's where you shall find the Magdalena alpine. So I came back, I got my dad to bring me back early one day to have time to do that. And I went up there and I found my first Magdalena alpines. And those big black velvet butterflies course up and down the rock sides, very romantic, very wonderful, looking for the females. They've been a fixture of my life ever since. In fact, I'm just about to embark on the 10th draft of a novel I've been working on for a very long time, my apprenticeship in fiction really, called Magdalena Mountain, which incorporates those experiences in the butterflies, though it's a human story. And I think I finally am reaching what that book needs. But it all goes back to that day, and my whole life does as an academic and even as a poet, because meeting those men and the women at the station too, as I got to know them over the years, they enlivened me to see what an intellectual connection with nature could be. And so several years later, I came back to study at Gothic as a graduate student with Remington. That was sweet. And then that was in 74. And then in 84, I went back there to teach conservation biology myself. And Ehrlich was a guest lecturer in my course. So this is, a quarter century of acquaintance increasing in different ways with that place.
This is wonderful, isn't it? And it's wonderful that your relationship with Remington turns out to have been one of the really formative relationships of your life, almost as though he were your intellectual parent or something of that kind.
Do you know, I think I've called him that, perhaps. I do feel that, and to have met him at 12 years old, and then later to have his encouragement. And so I was not in Cambridge, but near there at a place called the Monkswood Experimental Station in 1971, doing the Fulbright on butterfly conservation. And that's when I decided we needed the Xerces Society, named for the extinct Xerces blue butterfly, as a mechanism, as a focus for these interests back in the States when I came home with everything I'd learned from the Brits who were doing it all. And so I sent out a postcard. I had it printed up in Huntingdon, and I sent it to every lepidopterist I knew. And a lot of conservationists said, we're going to have the Xerces Society. We're going to protect butterflies in their habitats. Join us, and so on. Well, I got a note right back from Remington. I hadn't talked to him for some years, I think. And he said, so excited, so interested that you're doing this. As a matter of fact, the Lepidopterist Society is 25 years old this year. This will have been in 1972. He said, we're going to have our 25th annual meeting in San Antonio at Trinity University, and I'm putting on a symposium on endangered and extinct Lepidoptera. He had acquired a collection of endangered and extinct Lepidoptera at the Peabody Museum of Natural History at Yale, where he was curator of entomology as well as professor of biology. And when he had his Guggenheim at Oxford, he would frequent the insect marts, the Bourse he'd go over to Brussels and Berlin, and then in London there were big insect auctions in those days for the collectors. These were an artifact of the 19th century, but they carried on well into the 50s and even the 60s. And he didn't have much money as a graduate student there, but he invested in some lots of butterflies that he knew already would not be seen again, and brought them back to Yale, where I guess he had just finished his doctorate at Harvard and had just begun teaching at Yale when he had that Guggenheim. And so he set up this collection of endangered and extinct butterflies prior to the Endangered Species Act, so some of them could still be collected. Of course, no one knew they were going to be declared endangered in a few years, so ethically it was not a problem. It's hard to collect an insect to death. It's like swatting mosquitoes to extinction until they become very, very rare, and then that collecting could be the coup de grace. But so carefully, he brought in the rare things and things that he anticipated might become extinct. Some of them did. So he had this collection from which they could look in the future at the genes and at their reconstruct their ecological needs and find out why they became extinct, that sort of very, very important collection. And so he decided based on that and some very early writing that had begun to appear about butterfly conservation. I wrote my first essay on it in 1967, and there were 2 or 3 other things that appeared about that time. He decided in '72 to put on a symposium on endangered and extinct lepidoptera at the meeting in San Antonio. And he wrote me at Monkswood and he said, "You must come and tell us all about your Xerces Society and what the Brits are doing over there, and bring them if you can." Well, they didn't have the money to come, so I went and I took some tapes of them and so on. I had to contact the only person I knew of means and borrow the money to get to San Antonio, but I made it and attended that meeting, launched the Xerces Society, more or less its coming out party. A lot of suspicion of it at that time. They thought we were going to try to ban collecting, which is still very important in entomology. And I tried to convey the impression that this is all about habitat. This is about conserving the habitat of small-scale wildlife. It's becoming advanced in Britain, but not here. People got it, and that was a good launch for Xerces. But it was a remarkable launch for me as well, because after my talk, Charles Remington took me to lunch, and he said, "You should come to Yale and do a PhD on this." Now, as I told you, I flunked physical chemistry twice. My hard science bone is not the strongest bone in my body. I can do it, and I have done it, and I published in it. But the poet has emerged stronger, and so I knew enough science by that time to know that I could probably manage and enjoy it, but I wasn't at all sure about getting into Yale. And he said, "Well, you've got a master's in forestry already. I have a joint appointment in the School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, and you had this Fulbright. Based on that, I'm pretty sure we can get you in." Well, I got in to the graduate school at Yale through the anteroom of Forestry and Environmental Studies without any problem. Since he had a joint appointment, and then I sort of slid over into biology and was able to draw upon both. We became intimate over the next 3 years, intellectually and in activism. We worked together very closely on activism. My wife at the time, an English woman named Sally Hughes, who went on to a career in Oxford later, got the idea that we should start a 4th of July butterfly count, like the Christmas bird count of the Audubon Society. Well, Remington stepped in and said, "I've always wanted to see a nationwide count," and he enabled that to happen. So on many levels we worked together far beyond what you would expect from a faculty committee member. Socially, his wife and he conducted a sort of a salon, conversation evenings of an earlier era. And though he was a raconteur and a big male ego, he was capable of conducting an evening almost like a coach in a handball match, batting the ball, the conversational ball, around to everyone in the room, including the diffident and the women who often didn't speak up as much as their mouthy male graduate student husbands. There were women who needed no help in that regard. And I don't mean to suggest that women need help in conversation, but as you know...
But those were the mores of the time.
Those were the mores of the time that the women didn't always get their word in. Charles made sure they did, and everyone else in the room as well. That was impressive to me. So I'm going on and on about Charles, but the point was, yes, Don, he made an enormous impact in my life, and we remained dear friends until he died. I had another great mentor in England who enabled me to come and study there, John Heath, who ran the British Biological Records system, which really was the first great application of applied biogeography to conservation. And it inspired my doctoral dissertation. It inspired lots of things we've done since. But he was my mentor there, and he was sort of I call him the midwife of the Xerces Society. And Charles Remington was really the godfather. He let me base it there at Yale the first few years and get it going in a big way.
I think this is a fascinating story because it's not often that you see that lovely storyline that you have in your career here. I mean, here we are 45 years after you had that thought on a train that there should be a butterfly conservation society. We should call it the Xerces Society. And then right now, when you hand me the business card, it's the Xerces Society.
I can't believe it. I can't believe it. It's almost half a century later, and I say it's 45 years old. It's got 45 staff. They're almost all young. They're way predominantly women, which was not the case in entomology back then. One of them just discovered a new species of butterfly out in the woods. I'm going to see a colleague tomorrow at the other university in the valley, Oregon State, up the valley. Tomorrow we're writing a paper describing some new subspecies of the Mariposa copper butterfly, and one of them was this very distinct, very isolated, very important conservation item was discovered by a staff member of the Xerces Society doing fieldwork for them. So I can't tell you how thrilling this is for me.
Isn't that wonderful?
And you're right, the continuity of story, and I feel so lucky. I mean, I'm not a fatalist in any way, and I never say it was meant to happen and mean it in the sense that I do believe in free will. Obviously, there's our epigenetic rules that Ed Wilson talks about, and there are limits on what we do genetically, and of course things happen. But I do believe in stochastics, that things happen and we adapt to them, and we make choices within whatever we have of free will. And then serendipity occurs, but I think everyone's invited to Serendipity's picnic, but you got to be aware, you got to accept the invitation. You've got to see what happens and then make choices based on that. I've been extraordinarily lucky in the choices that have been offered me like that.
Well, not every 12-year-old boy would come over a ridge and say, Dr. Remington, right? You know, you're ready for that piece of serendipity, right?
My father, who bought me, wasn't really a naturalist, but he was a fisherman, and he saw what this meant to me. My mother, too, though they were separated, they each gave me my first 2 great butterfly books. My mother was a naturalist, so they encouraged me. But my father saw a newspaper article about a Gates Rubber Company shift worker, Ray J., really Ray Jablonski, but he was hiding his Polish identity at that time in Denver. There was some hangover, depression, prejudice. So he was Raymond J., and he was a great butterfly collector, traded butterflies with Nikita Khrushchev's son and so on. My father saw the newspaper article about him, tracked him down, took me to meet him. He told me about the Lepidopterist Society, which is why I knew about Remington. So all these things have precedence.
Yeah, yeah.
They go back. And I mentioned Ed Wilson a moment ago, E.O. Wilson of Harvard. One of the things that's really nurtured Xerces is we've had a succession of extraordinary presidents. Just as the presidents of the British Butterfly Conservation Society, now called British Butterflies, which is in some ways our model. I mean, Xerces has gone way beyond butterflies. It's invertebrates. But British Butterflies presidents have been Sir Peter Scott, David Attenborough. They take something of an active role, and they're not just figureheads, but it's their name. So Xerces has followed that model, and we had Ed Wilson was president of Xerces for 10 years, and other May Barenbaum and Steve Kellert and other prominent people in conservation and entomology, and so that's given it a certain cachet that's increased its respectability and brought people to us. So back in the early 80s, in the early struggling days of Xerces, when it was all volunteer, up and down, we were known in some of the university entomology departments as the Xerces Society. These people were going to come along and conserve all the bugs. And now when I go to a university entomology department, not environmental studies, but an entomology department, they all want to know how they can get a job with Xerces.
Isn't that neat?
That happened in Corvallis recently. So that's a big, lovely change too.
Well, there's something else that goes on here that I think is really quite beautiful, and I worry that maybe gets lost. When I was working on the Living Beach, I got to know a little bit about conchology and that whole peculiar subworld of people who are passionate about shells and have these vast collections and know enormous amounts about them and actually uncover new species because they're out there searching for shells. And there's a kind of a zone here where the professional scientists on the one side and the literally amateur, he who loves, on the other side, actually meet in this zone in the middle, but not always happily. And usually their shared passion for that aspect of the world carries them over any little difficulties there are, and then that allows private citizens to make real scientific contributions.
Not in many areas, and you put it absolutely perfectly. That's the model. That's been the model of the Lepidopterist Society, and that was the direct, explicit intention of Charles Remington and Harry Clench when they started that. Harry's father was the curator of malacology at the U.S. National Museum. There's a lot of seashell butterfly interfaces, you know. But yes, it's not that way in Britain as much. I mean, there's a very robust amateur obviously the seat of amateur natural history in Britain, the seat of most things in natural history in Britain, in the West at least. However, there was also the very class-ridden society and the very strong sense when I went over there of the professional and the amateur, yes, working together, interfacing, but fundamentally different. And you'd see it in accent. If you went to the Royal Entomological Society meetings, the accents were mostly Oxbridge. If you went to the British Entomological Society, the accents were commonly working class. I'd see it in government agencies where there would be an implicit class thing between the people from Cambridge and Oxford or London and those from the University of Bath or the University of Sussex or something. This pertains there. And then those who aren't from any university at all, the working people, certainly appreciated, but in many ways, I don't know if I'd go so far as to say look down on, but there's still definitely a gap there. And when I went to Spain to lecture, I found it's very strong there, and it's very, very strong in Mexico, extremely strong. The society, Societas Lepidopterologica Mexicanos, was all the professionals, the university people, and then there was another group for the amateurs, and they barely spoke to one another. Finally, a family came along who bridged them, and it's gotten better. It's gotten better in most of these places. But the U.S., Charles had seen that when he was in Oxford in the 50s, and he says, it's not going to be that way in the U.S. Much of the best entomology has always been done in this country by amateurs, much of the best natural history. And we're going to embrace that. So when they started the Lepidopterist Society, it's actually in the bylaws that it's not only open to, but fully encouraging of both the amateur and the professional. And it's always been that way. And I love that. And I got that from the very beginning. And of course, with my Gates rubber worker on the one side and my Yale professor on the other side, I mean, the model was right there for me. These guys are both cool. And then I would see them at the Lepidopterist Society meetings. I forgot to mention that the third summer I went up to Crested Butte, 61, the Lepidopterist Society, which was then only 14 years old, had its annual meeting at Gothic. So that third summer I got to meet a whole lot of other lepidopterists, including kids my age. 3 of us have gone on to write books on the butterflies of North America who were at that meeting that time. It reminds me of the friend of mine who translated Beowulf from a landscape standpoint, and he found himself on a couch in Reykjavik with 3 people. All 3 of them had translated and published Beowulf. You wouldn't think it was necessary, but anyway, so that meeting, I met them all, and I saw from the very beginning how so much of the good work is done by the amateurs, those who love. And actually, I've gone back and forth myself, because at times I've been employed based on my Lepidoptera expertise for the government of Papua New Guinea, working on the giant birdwing butterflies and so on. Other times I consider myself very much an amateur in pursuing my avocation. So I slide back and forth depending on my mood. But I've seen these models.
You've had it's interesting because from what I understand of your biography, you've had in some ways quite a coherent life, and in other ways it's quite a diverse set of experiences.
You're a perceptive interviewer.
Well,
goodness me. That no one's ever quite twigged that in the way you just have, but it's absolutely true. It's a mess in some ways if you just took the different parts and just articulated them. It would look like pretty darned random. Well, there's been very little random about it. There has been a lot of, as I say, stochasticity. A lot of stuff happens, and you pick and choose and you watch for. It sounds like the main chance. It sounds like opportunism, and in a way, it is, except in an intellectual way. I think it's been largely victimless. In fact, one of my guiding lights. This will sound self-promotional. I don't mean it that way, but I try to pursue choices in ways that will help others as well and bring pleasure to others. I have a weakness for that, especially the young. So I hope that the chances that I have taken have not been ruthless, as they certainly can be in academia. In fact, there are a number of times that I have disadvantaged myself professionally and certainly economically. because the opportunity was one which either did not appeal to me viscerally or seemed as though I wasn't the person for it. And I'm glad. I mean, just last week, I decided against applying for a fellowship, a teaching fellowship that I was invited to apply for. It would have been a wonderful thing, very well compensated, better than I've ever been compensated. I'm turning 70 this year. So to be asked to do such a thing, not that I was asked to apply, I wasn't asked to do it, but I felt as if I had a real chance. But although I'm far from retired as a writer and a naturalist, I've done an awful lot of teaching and lecturing and freelance work all over the place, away from home. And I'm really enjoying situating myself in Grays River now, and I was widowed 3 years ago, and I'm trying to make the place the home that I want it to be for the rest of my life. And I'm writing a lot of poetry, and I've two or three books in progress, and I'm having fun being there, and darn it, I don't want to go to do a big job again at this point. And so the choice is, thank you for the honor for asking me to apply. I'm really flattered, and there would be a lot to derive from it. To be able to teach intensively at this point, again at this stage of my career, would be quite wonderful, but thank you, no. So yeah, there has been a coherence, and the coherence has been largely based, I think, on some good luck and some very good people coming in at the right time and helping me to make some decisions and to facilitate some things for me, but also trying to see how the pieces might fit together. You can't prognosticate. You don't know what's going to happen. So for example, when I got my PhD finally with Charles, I then, of course, had in mind an academic career. I thought, I'll go to university. But it was a very awkward time in the U.S. to be a new white male PhD recipient. Affirmative action had just come in, thank God, and there were, thank all the gods. The academies were chiefly full of white males. Desperately needed to be, diversity had to increase. And it was a blunt edge, the affirmative action. And it did not advantage necessarily new young white male PhDs. Some people got upset about that and sued and so on, things like that. Well, no. Politically, I was right there. I could see exactly, and I would have voted for it myself. But I was just in an awkward demographic. But you see, that in itself was a great advantage, because it eliminated a number of things that I almost certainly would have gone and done that might have led to an entirely different career, and that might have been fine. But after I was second or third behind a person of color or a woman for the 10th or 20th time, and 3 times in a row at Evergreen College, where I finally last wanted to teach, an experimental college in Olympia, Washington, it's a wonderful place, I found myself taking other kinds of opportunities. The hires, by the way, were always good hires, fine hires, people that stayed probably much longer than I would have done, and so on. And I went off and I did conservation jobs. I worked in New Guinea on the birdwing butterflies. That was one of the greatest opportunities a young naturalist could ever have. I worked as the first regional land steward for the Nature Conservancy. It was a great, fun, pioneering thing too. I enjoyed the pioneering role more than the long run, perhaps.
Well, and with the Xerces Society, as it got launched, you remained as an advisor, but you had pioneered it, and that was your time, right?
That's right. It might be seen as a lazy trait to kick things off and get the fun part and then have somebody else do the hard work. I mean, I've worked for Xerces all these years. Yes, I don't mean to say I haven't, but that's right. In fact, it was that time, early 80s, when I had to make a big choice. You come to these T-junctions in your life, you know, that really everything hinges on that. One of them was meeting Remington in July of 1959. This was another one. I had had what I now consider very much fortunate experience in my early academic applications, and I realized that if I continue, of course, I'll get a job eventually. It might not be where I had first wanted to, you know, but I will get an academic job if I carry on. Or by that time, I had established myself in the Nature Conservancy with a footstep where I could have had a career there. I was only the second PhD level biologist in the whole conservancy, and I could have stepped from that land stewardship into other jobs with the conservancy and had a career there. Or by this time I'd done a lot of volunteer work for IUCN, the International Union for Conservation of Nature, which led to a job when I left the conservancy and went out to the countryside where I live now to try to write full-time, realizing that wasn't going to work for a livelihood at first. I took a contract with IUCN to help to establish and manage the Species Conservation Monitoring Center in Cambridge. That's one that I helped another person, Jane Fenton, get going and then quickly got out of because management is not my métier. But I was happy to get it going. But then I did stay on there for 3 years to do the first invertebrate red data book. There were all these red data books of vertebrates, the International Endangered Species compendiums, but with Peter Scott's blessing, we did the first one for invertebrates. So what I did during that time, my wife at the time was an English woman, and she had studied museum studies at Leicester. And we went, but she was an artist, and so we went back and forth, did 6 months in Cambridge working, and 6 months back at Grays River doing art and writing, and it was really quite wonderful. But at the end of that time, there was a house fire that my house sitters had, and things come to a head at different times of your life. And the house was saved, but it was clear that life as it was wasn't going to continue at that time, and I had to make the decision, okay, now do I go on and pursue an academic career? I'm just about close enough to the degree where I can still do that. Or do I go with TNC, or do I go with IUCN? And all three of them seemed to lead to a desk and to an awful lot of paper. This is pre-digital. And out of the field and away from the kind of writing that I found I was enjoying more and more and more. And so on a winter's night in 1982, this is another T-junction, I said, none of the above. And I scratched off those different careers, thankful that I'd had the experiences in them, and said, I really am going freelance now. So I've been freelance since '82. And I've never had a full-time job since then, with the exception of 2 visiting professorships at Utah State and at University of Montana to set up and run environmental writing programs and to teach intensively. And both of those were magical, wonderful experiences because I've done a huge amount of teaching for a day or a week or an hour, but to teach in a real professorial manner, get to actually be a professor, yes, did want to someday to be a professor, get to actually do that for 2 full semesters at good universities in good departments with wonderful students was a benison in my life. It was something I'm very, very grateful for. But it did leave me realizing that I was kind of glad at the end of that time that I was going back to my own pursuits, because that's very hard work. You know, you've worked in a lot of universities.
I have. And like you, I've been totally freelance most of my life, you know, and it's not an easy road to hoe. But you found a very interesting sort of series of things to put together. You've done some teaching, you've done some lecturing, a lot of writing, and the writing has been not closely focused, but in a broad area. It's been a broad, coherent area where one thing leads to another, and you know what you did on the last book informs what you're doing on the next one to some extent. To some extent it does. In this recent book, The 50 Years of Writing for Nature, The Green Lands, in some ways it shows how eclectic it's been, but in another way it shows how it has had a chord running through it. The very first piece in that book was the only one that had been unpublished. These were all selected from periodicals. None of them were from the books. We're doing another collection of selections from the books now. But the first thing I included was an essay I wrote at the age of 18. My mother and I were caught up in the mountains on a butterfly trip by a landslide. Sounds dramatic. We weren't in the landslide. We were behind it. We just couldn't get back to Denver was all. So we had to stay in a mountain motel, which in itself was kind of an adventure for a kid. I was just out of high school. Now, I had never wanted to write in high school, Don. I could write, and I found I could earn money for college by winning essay awards in citizenship or Americanism, things I never perjured myself, but I was apolitical. I just knew what they wanted to hear. And I could get easy B's and sometimes A's
through my writing.
Well, and you had at least one teacher who encouraged you very strongly.
Mrs. Franson in 4th grade. Oh, you're very attentive. And yes, my 4th grade teacher.
But there's another thread, right, that goes back to the 4th grade.
Absolutely. I could put
today.
Mrs. Franson right there with John Heath and Charles Remington.
Yeah.
That's right, because if she hadn't encouraged my writing about nature and conservation in 4th grade, but then that didn't repeat during junior high and high school much. I had good English teachers. I really did. I mean, I can't fault their pedagogy, but they never made me feel really like writing. In fact, my 11th grade teacher accused me of plagiarism because I had a larger vocabulary than most kids. It wasn't good writing. It was a crow's vocabulary, but I would throw it out, you know, and sometimes snow a teacher. It didn't snow her, but instead of telling me it was bad writing, she thought I had plagiarized. That really offended me. So I came out of high school never wanting to see another essay. They didn't teach us essay in the E.B. White sense or the Montaigne sense. They taught us exposition. Didn't interest me. And so, but that summer, my mother and I were caught up in the mountains, and I went out behind the Piney Wood Lodge and into the aspens and the just like this marvelous graphic for the Field Conference, into that aspen wood. The fox wasn't there, but I was there for the fox. So into the aspen woods in the rain, and I had my little kid epiphany, you know, an 18-year-old epiphany of the rain and the moss and the aspens in this wet, rainy summer in Colorado, which wasn't normally, and things felt alive and green, but I saw some conflicts with some human trash and this and that, you know, and I went through this little, I said little, for me it was large at the time, this feeling of what's right. And I came back and I wrote this little essay about it, and ending up saying something like, if one has the love of nature and green in one's heart, one can never go wrong. Well, I didn't quite say that, it wasn't that bad. And so I came across this essay on the original Motel Stationery when I was compiling this book, and I said, you know, it's not that bad. It's callow and overwritten and self-important and awful in some ways, but it's also actually has a few phrases that I would still be happy to write, and it stated a verity that I still live by. And then I realized that I've been trying to write that same essay for 50 years in different ways. So yes, there is a chord that goes through them all, and there's a chord that goes through all the different events, even though it seems extremely disjunct, perhaps. I try to see the connections and how they might affect the next, and you can never tell. I didn't know my dear wife Tia was going to get ovarian cancer, you know, and have that for 10 years and then die way too young, which radically altered my life in many ways. You don't know how these things are going to happen, but you can judge how one choice might draw from choices you've made in the past and how it might affect things that come in the future. And if you're lucky, you might make some good guesses.
It seems to me that in order to succeed, and you seem to have done it extraordinarily well, but in order to succeed in a kind of freelance, almost a freelance intellectual would be a phrase for it, because it isn't just writing, it's much else too.
I like the term independent scholar, same thing.
Yep. But you know, if you have to be, I was just trying to think of what that image is. There ought to be an image for it, and I think the closest I can come is what they call in Newfoundland when the kids go copying over the ballocators.
Say it again.
Copying over the ballocators. And the ballocators are little ice pans, right? And in Cape Breton, where I live, the kids used to call it jumping clampers.
Jumping clampers.
Because clampers are these small ice cakes, you know?
Oh, that's lovely.
Yeah. And when the ice is breaking up in the spring, the kids would go out and they would, you know, scamper across these things. And, you know, you'd land on one that was going to sink, so you wouldn't stay on it. You'd just land on it long enough to spring off to the next one.
And the copying is the one following the next?
Well, it's a phrase for running and jumping. It's a Newfoundland phrase, copying over the, yeah. And the ballocators is what they call in Cape Breton the clampers. So jumping clampers, copying over the ballocators, same thing. And in a sense,
wonderful language.
And it's not a bad description.
That's not a bad description at all. I really want to get that from you and borrow that. I feel that I've been copying over the ballocators all this time. That's right. Sometimes they sink a bit. Yeah.
The other image that strikes me as recurring in your work is ridges. First, you've got the ridge-encrusted butte where you come up with the butterfly net and come down to Charles Remington. But you've also got this phrase that you pulled out of Nabaka, who was another lepidopterist, right? But you've got that phrase about walking the high ridge. Tell me about that.
That's been an extraordinary one. May I just backtrack for a minute in case we don't get back to it, just to say I just want to respond momentarily to what you said about how it seems as though I've done this extraordinarily well or successfully or whatever word you use. I feel very gratified by my freelance existence. However, I have to say that in case a young person were to hear this interview, that I have done very poorly economically. By many measures, not by mine, because I've almost always paid my bills. I paid off a mortgage. I don't owe anybody anything. But I've never had 2 dimes to rub together much, you know. It's been an economically stress time. And I have to say that my partners did suffer sometimes from the economic stress of it. Nothing new, you know, talk to Robinson Jeffers or Richard Jeffries or Henry Williamson, any of them. Their wives were always, can you make a little more money? You know, and because we do prejudice those who are dependent upon us when we make these choices. There's no question, you know. I mean, and I didn't have children. I think it would have been much harder if I had had children. I had wonderful stepchildren by whom I have some great grandkids now, but only for 3 or 4 years did I have children living with us. And had we actually hadn't brought up children ourselves, it would have been much harder to make some of the economic decisions I made. It's easier for a couple to go without health insurance for 20 years than it is when you have children. But things did get better. I did it as a tripod. The writing has been about 1/3 of my support. Lecturing has been about 1/3, and then freelance teaching of various kinds. And then occasionally a little strut of consulting. Never environmental impact statement stuff for the National Park Service or some butterfly things. But that's been the primary constituents of my livelihood. And once that's provided for, then the choices that I've made have been independent of that. But once the Society for Conservation Biologists gave me an award called for a person Distinguished Service Award for a person on the outside was the name of the award. And so they asked me to write something for the newsletter. Everyone at the meeting said, I want to be freelance like you. I want to get out from under my boss or my company. I said, do you really? So I wrote about what it was like to be on the outside, you know, without health insurance, you're doing your own photocopying, you're paying your own Social Security contribution every year, and all of this.
That's just so funny. Because when I was asked what I missed about university teaching when I quit my tenured job at 34 to go out and be a freelancer, I said the first thing I said was, I miss the photocopier.
I know. I ended up with a great little gig in my local schools. I don't accept very many invitations to schools because they're absolutely exhausting and they don't have any money to pay you anything. So I do every now and again, just little freebies. Like next week I'm going up to the outdoor school at the CISPAS Center for Environmental Studies in the Cascades to give my annual Bigfoot talk to the kids. So I do some of that. But I had a thing going in my local tiny county, our little school district, where I would give one class talk for a ream of photocopying. And that worked out really well for a few years. Well, anyway, so it came together, and then finally, one reason I so much appreciate the age at which I've arrived is Medicare and Social Security. I do my obeisances every day to Hyde Park, New York for FDR, for Social Security, and Johnson City, Texas for LBJ for Medicare. Everyone should have these kinds of supports, of course. I quip in my book Wintergreen about how if Captain Gray had never come to Gray's Harbor, no, how does this go? Oh, no, I know. If he hadn't come into the mouth of the Columbia River 6 weeks before Vancouver's man Broughton did, then Washington and Oregon territories would have become part of Canada. And I would have had health insurance all these years. Well, anyway, you asked me, I'm sorry, I went back to the economic thing, but your recent question was about Nabaka and the high ridge, the ridges.
That's right.
That is a central metaphor and reality in my life. I think a lot of my metaphors are also realities. I'm much more physical than I am abstract in some ways. Of course, the high ridges themselves, as you say, were terribly important for me with the Magdalena Alpine and so on. But I began to study Vladimir Nabokov's work because I read him as literature, but I also knew his butterfly work. He had curated the butterflies at Harvard and written a number of really very important papers on the blue butterflies before the success of Lolita, when then his career returned entirely to literature, and the butterflies became again an avocation for him. But for some years they were actually vocational for him. And he pursued both parts of his life, the poetry and fiction, and also the science. So I was asked by Beacon Press if I would edit a book of Nabokov's butterfly writings from throughout his oeuvre, the fiction, the poetry, even the scientific work, and so on. And I did, but I ended up doing it with Brian Boyd, his biographer from New Zealand. And we did this book, great big doorstopper, beautiful book called Nabokov's Butterflies, and it's got all of his butterfly writing from throughout his work. It's a treasure chest. But in writing my introduction to it, which is called Between Climb and Cloud, which was a beautiful phrase of his, Nabaka among the lepidopterists, I researched, well, I read much of his work to find the butterfly sections, which were far more numerous than anyone even realized. And I found a book review he'd written for the New York Times Review of Books, and a New York Times Book Review, about a book about Audubon's butterfly art. And in that, he used the phrase, "Does there not exist a high ridge where the mountainside of scientific knowledge meets the opposite slope of artistic imagination?" In this obscure source, not the New York Times is obscure, but this little book review way back when, nobody had ever anthologized that in any of his things. And I saw it and I said, whoa, that's not only a great thing for our book, but that's a great thing for my life. And it's been one of my operating principles ever since, because I realized that's what I've always been trying to do. When I struggled early in my PhD between my perceptual, aesthetic, poetical side and trying to do the science I needed to do to get the PhD, which I ultimately did and ultimately worked out, I was troubled by the conflict. And later I came through that to realize this isn't a conflict. This is the fact that I have both of these dimensions to my life that both want to be honored. And they can be. And they meet at this high ridge. And occasionally you'll actually write something where they meet in the same document. And Nabokov did. He, for example, has some wonderful discursive metaphorical writing in his scientific papers, which nobody gets away with these days. But they were just as descriptive as his strictly scientific work. So you can't always write the same thing. You can have William Carlos Williams was a doctor and a great poet. But you don't want him writing poetry when he's diagnosing your stomach ulcer. And you don't want the bridge builder writing a play when he's building his bridge. So we do have to, compartmentalize a little bit. But there's nothing to say that we can't be whole people. We don't have to live with one hand tied behind our back and with one arrow in our quiver. We can be both artists and scientists. We can honor our left and right brains and our analytical sides and our lyrical sides. And that's what I have tried to do.
Mm-hmm. And basically, it's honoring both knowledge and imagination.
That's
right?
exactly right. That's perfectly put.
It's wonderful to see that as something that, as you kind of go through your life, you can kind of see you're caromming off this bank of knowledge and caromming off this one of imagination, and you get together in the middle, the moments when you're particularly happy with the way it's all worked out.
When that happens, it seems I can always find a person who entered my life at that time who was the lever or the catalyst for that. So Remington, Heath, Mrs. Franson, so on. But another time came for me that was extremely important in mingling these two parts of myself, these two parts of the world, through my own imagination and knowledge, when I became affiliated with the Orion Society. Now, I had written a column for the very first issues of Orion, the first 3. But the column failed. It had too many cooks at the stew. Everybody had a different, the early editors of Orion had different ideas what they wanted this column to be. It was called The Niche of a Naturalist. And none of us were happy with what came out. Many years later, I was asked to come to an Orion event on Cape Cod when John Hay, the great Cape Cod writer, who actually wrote a book on the New England beaches that that has some bearing upon, or some, I don't want to say it's like your book, because your book is distinct, but they follow this tradition of this wonderful beach writing, like Charlton Ogburn's The Winter Beach, and your book, I think, is the definitive one here. But John Hay was receiving an honor from Orion for his work, and then they were going to start the John Hay Medal. And they gave that medal over the next several years to Jane Goodall and E.O. Wilson and Wendell Berry and Gary Snyder and Ann Zwinger and Homero Regis and Peter Matheson, a lot of good people. Well, because I got invited to that first one for John Hay, I got back with Orion. There weren't any bad feelings over that failed column. It just was an idea that didn't work out. But a few years later at the Gary Snyder event, the publisher came to me again. He said, "We want to start a column again. Would you consider doing it?" And I said, "Remember last time?" And he said, "Nah, but we got in your way last time. Now we know you're writing and we want you to take it and run with it." So I got to write that column in Orion for 10 years, 52 of them. And to have that kind of a bully platform, except not really, I wasn't really, sometimes they were issue oriented, but they were really writing exactly what was on my mind, what I was feeling at that time, most acutely at that time. It was an extraordinary opportunity. They were called the Tangled Bank, from that wonderful final paragraph in The Origin of Species, when Charles Darwin says, "It is interesting to contemplate a tangled bank full of writhing insects and blooming plants." He goes on in this paragraph to recapitulate his entire career in one paragraph. So I called it the Tangled Bank, and those essays have been collected by Oregon State recently. But because of all this going on with Orion, I got invited to go along on what were called the Forgotten Language Tours. The title came from a poem by W.S. Merwin, another recipient of the Hay Award. Merwin said, "I want to tell the story of the trees. I will have to speak in a forgotten language." This was written a little bit before he received the Pulitzer for his work. And so Chris Marshall, who runs the international writing program at Iowa now, took that idea and that phrase and started a barnstorming tour of nature writers in the biggest sense of the word, people who write about more than human. And he'd have 5 or 6 core writers, and we'd travel to a particular part of the country and meet up with local writers and give readings and workshops and sometimes walks and so on. And I was, being freelance, I was available, and I got to do that a number of times. And I got to travel with the most wonderful array of writers, Kim Stafford and Ann Swinger and Barry Lopez and Terry Williams and all kinds of good people, Richard Nelson and Scott Russell Sanders. And we would go into these places and see how the good word, language in the land, could arouse people. And this all, of course, goes into conservation because it's that arousing. Edwin Way Teale, that was another person I met at a key time when I was in Connecticut. The most widely read American nature writer at the time, Edwin Way Teale. And first nature writer to ever win a Pulitzer. And I bugged him until I got to meet him. And then had 3 wonderful seminal visits with him when I was at Yale. He was the first to pointedly decide to make a career as a freelance American nature writer, and did so wonderfully. Well, by the same token, on these tours, the Forgotten Language Tours, I got to travel with some of the best poets working in landscape and the human heart and poetry. Patty Ann Rogers and Allison Deming and several others. And I started hearing their poems. I'd written poems desultorily over the years, but I finally started seeing what power there was in a few words. Then when the Nabaka project came along and I saw what he had done with his poetry, as well as with long novels, I became interested. And I think from that came my own love of poetry, and I've been reading and writing a lot of poetry since. But once again, I see the particular people that came into my life at a particular time.
I want to switch our focus at this point, because one of the things I'd really like to hear you talk about is loving damaged lands.
I believe my love of damaged lands, well, I know it came from my ditch on the edge of Denver to begin with. I grew up in one of the first post-war subdivisions on the edge of Denver when Aurora was very small. Not a bad place to grow up by any means, but a grid of streets with similar houses. and young yards plunked down into the prairie. So not very interesting. But my brother came home one day and he said, "Bobby, there's a ditch. It's cool. Come on." And I was still on trainer wheels. I was 7 at the time, I think. Six the first summer we found it. And I went over there, and we spent much of our childhoods, whenever we could, going to that ditch. It was a high-line canal. It was a high line of the land water canal that took water from the mouth of the Platte River west of Denver, came down out of the reservoirs in the mountain, and diverted it around to the farmlands to the east. It was a speculative project built in the 1890s that enabled the speculators to sell that land that they had acquired cheap from Jay Gould and the railroad magnates who got it from the government for building the railroads. There's never enough water. The rights were too junior. Most of those farms failed. But they made a buck in the process and built a damn good canal. And that canal, as it ceased to have much value for irrigating places, except for a few farms, took on enormous value for the children of Denver and its surrounds, because it became the place where kids from all over, all sides of Denver would go to float on inner tubes, or to find frogs and crawdads, or to do whatever kids do when they're out there. All the things that Richard Louv is hoping that kids will start doing again to avoid the nature deficit disorder. Well, that was tailor-made for us, and that canal, even though it wasn't glamorous, became my special place as a kid. Now, the mountains, as I told you, were what really seduced me, but I couldn't get there very often, and so the canal stood in. And yet it was a hurt place. It was already over-farmed, eroded, bashed about, and yet parts of it were extremely beautiful, almost like a bucolic stream. And I came to see side by side, as a young boy, that places could be entrancing, beguiling, bewitching, and yet also be dangerous and threatening and not pretty and not whole. My sense of that grew into junior high and then high school as I saw the habitats that I came to love, and the butterfly colonies I knew become extinct one by one as subdivisions moved out, as my own new school was built, and so on and so forth. And so before I even left high school, I started lobbying the City Council of Aurora to protect habitats on the canal. Many years later, the canal has become a major urban greenway, and there are efforts to protect all the last remaining good bits. And there are parts of it that are still very lovely, unsurprisingly in the more affluent parts of Denver. And in some of the less privileged parts, the canal is a junk heap and it's eroded down to the banks. But there's a big effort now to try to reclaim its as a green umbilicum all through the city, which is what I had proposed in my book, The Thunder Tree, which was my book about that canal. But in that book is when I first expressed this feeling that I had of the love of damaged lands, how damaged lands are what brought me really close to nature. It wasn't the wilderness. I loved going up to the wilderness, and I did too occasionally. But you come back again to home, and home was almost always in a damaged place or an altered place. Also, during the writing of that book, I came to realize that there was another driving principle for me that I called the extinction of experience. Charles Remington asked me to go to Boston in the spring of my second year at Yale to give a talk in his stead at a AAA, an American Association for the Advancement of Science meeting, at a panel called Wildlife in the Year 2001. This was 1975. Maybe 2000 was, I don't know. And he said, I don't have time to go out. Can you go and give a talk about something? And I'd already done quite a bit of public speaking, so I did. And what am I going to talk about? Well, I'll talk about these extinctions that I have witnessed on my canal in Colorado and what they've meant to me. And what I realized they meant to me was the erosion of wholeness. And the term came to me, the extinction of experience. That it's not only the loss of entire species in a worldwide context that matter, but it's the loss of common things near us in our own, what I call our radius of reach. And the radius of reach is much smaller for the poor, the very young, the ill, the disabled, than it is for the affluent, who can go off to Antarctica or whatever. But for those whose lives are constrained, what's around them right here, that's what they get. And as the common elements become extinct in that environment, then people become more isolated, more disinherited from their setting, and less whole. And this breeds apathy, inactivity, leading, of course, to further losses. So it's a cycle, and a cycle I came to call the extinction of experience. That's been quoted quite a lot now. And I love to see it when it's quoted without attribution, because it means the idea is entering the lexicon. You know, I see this, and that's gratifying. But it wasn't utterly original, nothing much is, but because it drew upon Ian McHarg's ideas of landscape capability, and it drew upon some other ideas. Later on, I came to find it had a lot to do with the idea of the diminished baseline that people talk a lot about. But I had the good luck of coming up with a darn good phrase, the extinction of experience, and put those two things together. And I realized that in a way was almost the apotheosis of the damaged lands, because the way that we can resist the extinction of experience, and of course that ties very much into the nature deficit disorder. Last Child in the Woods, Richard Louv has said that Thunder Tree and Extinction of Experience were one of his fundamental inspirations for that book, which makes me very happy, but it also makes me very happy that it's his book that became the giant phenomenon, because his life has been owned by it since, you know. I can go off and write my poems, and he doesn't have that leisure, but I realized that if we're going to fight the extinction of experience, and then later nature deficit disorder and so on, it's going to be through those hosed up lands. So when I went to the University of Washington and found that this big wonderful marsh had become largely a dump that the university had leased to the city as a landfill, and we occupied that land and we took it over, and now 50 years later it's a great in-city habitat, a restored marsh and so on. That, talk about damaged lands, that was given up by almost everyone, the Montlake Phil in Seattle, except for those who still birded around the marshy edges of it and saw beavers and knew what it used to be, and saw what it potentially could be. And we took it. The kids marched down there, took over that marsh, and said, it's not going to be paved, it's not going to be grass for playing fields, it's going to be restored as a marsh. And by God, that happened over 50 years. A lot of people doing a lot of work after that. And so those two early examples, the early conservation of parts of the canal and the what would become far more successful than I realized, take over the Montlake Phil, those two events showed me that we mustn't abandon the damaged lands, that they can become better, but even in their depleted condition, they can have do a lot of good. So Bill Birch, who was another professor at Yale when I was there in the forestry school, great proponent of ecological sociology, gave a talk once at the Natural Areas Association meeting, and he talked about Detroit and how there were 80,000 acres of urban forests there that have come up in the abandoned brick fields of the burned out, abandoned houses and tenements around Detroit. Well, this is a social disaster that is coming back in some ways, in Detroit, of course, but it's also an extraordinary opportunity to reconfigure Detroit into the future as a place with a great deal of green and a great deal of opportunity for kids to connect with nature. So the damaged lands are all around us. When I was lecturing in Cleveland one time, there was this piece of land at the mouth of the Cuyahoga, right at the mouth of it, there was this fenced off area of 50 acres or so, and there was ailanthus and other trees growing in there. And I asked my host, what's that space for? And they said, we don't know what's going to become of it. It's been condemned and it's been cleaned up, but it might be built, might be something. I said, that's got to be an urban green field. It's got to be a brown field that becomes a green field. And there were others there who had that objective too. I tried to reinforce it. I think that has come to pass. So right there in the center of urban Cleveland, there's a big big green resource now. And those kinds of things can come up. And this actually is what we have to do to fight in nature deficit disorder. Of course, part of it is the wiring from birth with the electronic, jack into our umbilici. Kids are just constantly into a reality that's mediated by electrons. Well, part of it's, of course, getting those off of them and getting them back out. That's obvious. But part of it, too, is the stranger danger, the fear of kids being out. And this is what I wrote about in Orion, last thing I wrote there. A feature a couple of years ago called Free-Range Kids. That wasn't my term. I called it, it's a good term. I had called it the freedom of the day. And I refer to the fact that when we were kids, I imagine, Don, you had the freedom to wander as a child. And well into a couple of generations, kids still had the ability to wander, to be free-range kids, to go out and say, bye, Mom, see you at dinner. Or for Mom to kick them out of the house and say, get back here at dinner, just don't be late for dinner. And we could wander. And the thing is, it wasn't gendered. In my childhood, and also the childhood of another generation after that at least, girls, too, had the freedom to wander in many places, in many cultures. It wasn't strictly a boy thing. And that was a very powerful force in many people's lives. Lots of groups I talk to, I say, how many can remember a special place? Oh yeah, they all can. How many had the freedom to wander? I call it the freedom of the day, to explore those special places. Almost everybody over 30 or 35 did. And then I asked the hard questions. How many of you can go back to your special place and find it still in similar condition? On very few hands. And how many of you have kids or grandkids who still have the freedom of the day, if they have such a place? No hands. These are huge changes in American culture. And it's not just America. I don't know if the same conditions pertain in Canada. I know to some extent they do in Britain and Germany, that there's a lot less liberty for the young. And of course, fewer places to go also. So if we can put these two ideas together, the damaged lands close to people's homes, the vacant lots, what's less curious to a curious kid than a vacant lot? What's less vacant? There's no vacancy in a vacant lot to a kid who's curious about what's out there. But if we can take these places and have them be near home to where kids could explore in them, supervised at a distance so they're physically safe, but not necessarily led on walks, not interpreted to. I've worked in the field of nature interpretation. That was another career I had for a while in the national parks. And yet I love nature interpretation, but it can get in the way of direct encounter sometimes. And I've seen wonderful kids exploring places become self-guided nature trails, and the mystery's gone. So places with mystery and just the figment of supervision, just enough to keep them safe. And maybe a little threat, and maybe a little, where am I going to take a poop? And, these are places where kids can do some clabber and damage and have some experience and learn a little self-reliance and a little direct connection to plants and animals and dirt and rocks. I think it's terribly important. And that's where the damaged places can come back home to help reconfigure a caring populace.
We've actually suggested a project that I'll tell you about when we're over. I don't know if it'll ever come to anything, but that's a very fruitful notion. I was just thinking about the phrase, the return of nature, and how you make space for the natural world to come back and reclaim these places that have been damaged. The other damaged lands that I wanted you to talk about are right around your own home in Gray's River, because this whole business of clear cutting, and not just clear cutting once, but over and over and over again, boy, that's something.
Yeah, the so-called Great North Woods. I'm so glad you came back to that, because this is the past 40 years of my life almost have been spent in these woods. Things I was talking about were things actually came earlier for the most part. But I grew up in Colorado, as you know. My mother had grown up in Washington, in Seattle, and my grandmother had been a pioneer teacher in Washington. So I heard lots of stories of the Great Northwest and the woods and the slugs and the rain and the moss. And that appealed to me. So I went to the University of Washington as a freshman and have been a Northwesterner more or less ever since, though I've lived in other places since. I always have come back. When I decided in 1982 to really try to freelance for good, I moved out to the place where I live now. Now, I had actually bought it in '78. If you can call borrowing some money for a down payment on an old farm buying something, I did that. And weekended there, and then, as I say, I did some 6 months back and forth there. Finally moved out there for good in '79, and then full-time in '82. Now, I found this place because when I was first cruising Southwest Washington for my very first book, Watching Washington Butterflies, which was my master's thesis, I was taking photographs of living butterflies. It was the first field guide to have, a North American field guide to have pictures of live butterflies instead of drawings. I found these big, broad, and yet intimate green velvet valleys in Southwest Washington that led down to the bays. In these subtle western hills, south of the Olympic Mountains, north of the Oregon Coast Range, subtle hills, broad valleys, steep ridges in between. It was very attractive to me, but there was a lot of logging. Now, I was based in a forestry school, which was very much a balkanized forestry school between the wildlife and the nature interpretation students and the pulp and paper and timber production students. Kind of the John Muir, Gifford Pinchot interface played itself out right there in our forestry school. And I was very much a young, radical conservationist at the university, and we did a lot of things. We fought for the North Cascades National Park. We fought against dams in the Grand Canyon. We took over the Mont Lake Fill and recreated the marsh. But, you know, I didn't really, even though I was in a forestry school, I was subject as much as anyone to the urban-rural bias and to the word is reductionism about forestry, and that loggers were bad and logging was bad. And so when I came out to that country and saw that clear cutting of the private timberlands in Southwest Washington, where there are no national forests, land went directly from the railroads to the Weyerhaeuser. The Indians were extirpated early. So simple land ownership history, and it all was logged very early. And as they say with Chicago voting, logged early and logged often. You know? And so a lot of that had already occurred. And yet I found such a valley with such a farmhouse, and it was very attractive to me, and big old trees the pioneer had planted, and I wanted that place. And I said, I'll deal with the logging. Maybe we can change it. So I moved in there, and then I realized as the years gathered that this was a land of logging, that the people depended upon that economy. This was the understanding. There weren't any national forests, there were no reserves, and most of it had already been logged and was coming back and being logged again. When I moved in there, actually, there were a lot of second growth stands that had been natural reproduction, and they were beautiful, 80, 90-year-old, pretty big trees, gaining some of the attributes of a late successional forest. There was almost no old growth in the area. In a way, that was almost a boon because we avoided the big spotted owl controversies close to home, because it was post-spotted owl. It's post-old growth, and in a way, some of the worst of the controversies of the 80s and 90s went over our heads because of that. I mean, that's kind of cold comfort. But it enabled us to start finding the last little bits of old growth, and I built constituencies among loggers too, who wanted a little bit of heritage forest left, schools, the county Democrats, the Granges, and we managed to get the last 5 or 6 chunks of old growth in our 2 counties down there protected, and they're all protected now. But it's all together, you put them all together, it's only about 20,000 acres. Whereas there's millions of acres that are in industrial forest land around there. And that has actually diminished and become more damaged because all that beautiful second growth that was there when I got there, I took for granted because it wasn't old growth, and we were keen on finding the bits of old growth and saving it. Well, there was the big timber turn down in the late 80s, and the Weyerhaeuser pulled out locally, and Crown Zellerbach broke their union. And all of a sudden, it was all back into the hands of the Jippo loggers, who are just family loggers trying to make a living, but they're not unionized, and they're not regulated in some of the same ways. And then big companies like John Hancock came in and bought up a lot of the Weyerhaeuser lands and administered it for maximum shareholder returns in the East, using the Jippo loggers in the West as contract loggers. So people weren't making a living wage in the woods anymore. The accident rate went up in the woods again, back to what it was in the 30s, pre-union. And the logging rate went back up to what it had been in an earlier time, the cut and run. And that second growth, that beautiful second growth, was liquidated in 15 years. It could have been 50 years of jobs, fiber, sparsed out, spaced out profits, but deferred profits in some cases. But no, it had to be short-term profits. It had to be maximum shareholder return. And that caused a mass conversion of a lot of those woods to short rotation pulp plantations of western hemlock and Douglas fir. The worst of which is the aerial spraying of herbicides in the springtime to prevent the growth of diverse vegetation that would interfere with the monoculture of the conifers. This isn't allowed on national forests or on state forests anymore, but it is on the private lands. It's the most benighted aspect of their management. And so I've lived among these enormities for 40 years. And I, in order to live there and to write critically of some of the logging practices and still be welcome in the community, not run out, I've been very circumspect in the battles I've chosen. I haven't tried to fight every timber sale. I haven't spoken ill of the local livelihood. In fact, I speak in terms of, I play upon the fact that I got 2 forestry degrees and once worked in the woods myself in Colorado. And I say, look, I know what my books are printed on. Barry Lopez calls it the flesh of the trees. And it's true. I'm not anti-logging, but I'm against logging that will hurt this community as well as the community of the woods. And a lot of people locally have kind of finally gotten that, and there have been some reforms. I'm not saying that I've turned around timber practices, by no means, but a lot of the people who care about a future forestry have implemented a number of reforms, smaller clear cuts. I think we're close to maybe eliminating the aerial herbicides. That would be a really big one. And then we can start trying to increase the rotation length. When Weyerhaeuser and Crown were doing it, even though we criticized them a lot, their rotation was usually 80 years. Now it's 25 to 35 years. And you just can't develop any diversity in that time. There's some value to elk and deer and bear, some, but not much, because the forest doesn't gain much fecundity in that time. But since we do have this little constellation of old growth preserves, with most of their constituent species, we've lost spotted owls, but we have marbled murrelets. And by the way, we've gotten some more late successional forests, not strictly old growth, but old second growth. We got some of that protected recently for the marbled murrelet. And so I'm not hopeless that there's a potential future real forest in these hills. But in the meantime, we live in a land of logging, and we live among a damaged land. And yet, this is what I write about in Wintergreen, that some people found a little bit apostate, but others have embraced that we can go into the clear cuts, which the urban conservation advocate would like to derogate as worthless. Things do live there, particularly if they haven't been sprayed. There is vital regrowth, not with the same diversity, but there are organisms there, and there are beauties there. Closely observed on the ground pines coming over, the healing bandages of the mosses and the lichens and the liverworts coming back from the sides and the patches. And I take great succor in that. And so people say, how can you live here and look at these clear cuts? And I say, well, one thing, it's like I tell kids about being a freelancer. Don't fall in love with filthy lucre. You know, have modest expectations materially, and that will serve you well. Same way there. Don't fall too much in love with any one stand of trees, unless you have protected it and can afford to. because it might not be there tomorrow. Steel yourself to that. I don't mean it's okay, but you gotta, it's like anywhere, Don. You gotta edit your surroundings. We all know sensitive people who cannot edit, and they're in constant disarray, constant chagrin, a permanent state of stress over loss. I wrote an essay in Iran once called Receding from Grief. That was even before I had my great grief of my loss of Tia. But we all suffer the grief of the loss of places all the time, places of our youth and so on. So I say, you can't steel yourself to that, because that would be wrong too. You need to feel it. But at the same time, seek the beauties in between the clear cuts, in between the damaged lands, even on the damaged lands. Love Canal, you could go there, and if you didn't get sick, you'd see some plants struggling to grow. So ultimately, you cannot throw away the land. You cannot discard the damaged lands. You might as well love them and see what you can do for them and get what you can from them.
Thank you. I think that's a very good place for us to stop a conversation that we can really easily carry on with for a long, long time.
We barely talked about butterflies in this interview, which was very refreshing. Most people want to ask me about butterflies all day long. We did Xerces, which was fine. But, you know, I've been very, very involved in monarchs for a very long time. In fact, we did the monarchs in the Invertebrate Red Data book, and in the early 80s we designated them an endangered phenomenon, and that was a new category for IUCN. And then actually back in '76, the year after the big Mexican aggregations were found, we designated them the top priority in world butterfly conservation. We've been involved in monarch conservation ever since. Now it's huge with the potential listing, the Three Amigos talks that Obama and Trudeau recently and Harper before, and the succession of Mexican presidents have had. Monarchs have come on their agendas every time and so on. But Barbara Kingsolver correctly deduced that monarchs will be affected by global warming, and she decided to work that into a fictional context.
You've said that you recharge your batteries by reading and writing poetry as well as by walking. How does that recharge your batteries? What does poetry mean in your life?
I do. Well, it didn't mean very much in my life back in high school and beyond. I think we were asked to read things that were possibly not entirely appropriate to us at that time, didn't touch our own experience. So I didn't hate poetry coming out of high school, but I didn't have any in college to speak of. I just didn't feel inclined to read very much of it. And occasionally I felt moved to write it, as most of us do, write a poem. They're bad poems. But it was really when I started traveling with poets for Orion that I began reading more poetry, because I would buy their books, and other poets who came along, and I began to realize that poetry, not only contemporary poetry, but some of the poetry I had eschewed earlier that I can read better now, because I'm a better reader now, actually touched me rather deeply. And that was something of a surprise, because I was at that time primarily a prose reader. So I began rather voraciously reading poetry and listening to poetry spoken and seeing what it could do for an audience, especially an audience who did not know that they appreciated poetry, which is most audiences. People aren't used to hearing poems. In my talk last night, I think much of the audience was surprised that I began with a poem, and poetry was a substantial part of my contribution. But as I saw the way that poetry first affected me and the way that it affected other people, I began to realize that a poem could be not only a source of entertainment, certainly solace at some times. We all know that certain poems will help us get through certain times. Some poems become cliched this way when they don't deserve that, though it's a kind of an honor in a way, I guess. But a poem could also be a medium of movement. It could cause people to alter their behavior, which is how I'd always treated essay. You could almost consider the poem as a tool to bring about a degree of awareness that a person might not have recognized in himself or herself before that. I saw this happen with a number of Patty Ann Rogers poems. They're they're sexy poems about nature. Her poem about the courtship of the hummingbird, I first heard of her at the last reading of the year at Elliott Bay Bookstore in 1994, and Barry Lopez started his reading by reading that poem of Patty Ann Rogers. Generous thing to do anyway, read someone else. But I heard that poem and oh my gosh, you one spinning ball of dripping scarlet oils and sperms. Oh, this beautiful, beautiful poem coming down just for me. And I was utterly struck, but it's also just sexy as could be. And I realized that a poem could affect a person on many different levels. So I started adding poems to my own readings. First, other people's poems. I would read a Patty Ann poem, The Power of Toads, for example, or The Family Is All There Is, or Rolling Naked in the Morning Dew. These are poems that bring out great delight in the hearer when read well. And people realize that poems need not be inaccessible. And then I started saying, well, I'd like to start doing this with my own poetry, but I had no confidence as a poet. So I started reading and writing and realizing that I got a number of different things from poems. If I were sad or I was affected by something, I might find that a poem was direct solace to me. Yes, this happens a lot, as with the poems that I wrote the day after the election and the day after the inauguration. I've shared these with people and they've told me, thank you for that little bit of solace. Well, that's my hope. But I also found I could get people virtually up out of their seats with the poem as I could with an essay, and in fact maybe better because they're short. To get people to listen to a whole essay in a reading is a bit of a challenge because the mind wanders after a little while, no matter how good it is or how well it's read. But a poem, even a longer poem of 4 or 5 minutes, if delivered well, and if punchy and accessible, telling a story and respecting language and having fun with the language can really get people jumping. So I wrote a poem. I traveled to Colorado for a butterfly meeting by Greyhound one summer. I was actually leading a tour and getting a paycheck for it, but I couldn't afford to get there any way except by Greyhound. And it was a bit of a bleak trip because the buses really have become well, they've always been the conveyance of the poor, but now they're the conveyance of the poor and often the addicted and the confused and the walking wounded. And it's easy to parody them, but it's not always funny. Anyway, I had a lot of experiences on this bus ride, both going and coming, and took them all down. And I realized, you know what, this is a poem. And so I wrote this poem called Ride On. I very often begin a reading with it. And I found people asking for it. And I said, well, it's not published yet. I haven't published it anywhere yet. And they wanted this poem. And that had that experience that somebody wanted my poem. Last night, a kid wanted to photograph that poem that I read for you in this interview, Unwanted Creatures. I said, well, I've never had anybody ask to photograph my poem before. Well, that's how you get it now, instead of making a photocopy.
Yeah.
I said, I was honored. But that meant that that poem spoke to someone else, not only to me. So this is one thing I've taken from poetry, is that it's concise, and in its concision, well, you can write it faster. That doesn't mean you can finish it faster. Poetry is very hard to do well, and even though you might get a draft down fairly quickly, I'll spend as long perfecting a poem. I never perfect it, but I'll spend as long editing a poem as I do a rather long essay sometimes. Nonetheless, because it's short, you can work on it in smaller periods of time, and you're not quite so intimidated as going to a big block of text. And the audience, once they get over the fact that, oh, well, I don't like poems, I don't listen to poems, I don't read poems. Oh, yeah, try this. Then you read them Right On, you know, or Unwanted Creatures or something, and they, oh, wow, that was a poem. So I guess I'd have to say that part of the attraction of poetry to me has been how it's made me feel, how it's expanded my spirit, how it has filled me with pleasure, joy, and pathos sometimes. All the things poetry is supposed to do. I finally got around to feeling that, though I didn't in high school, I do now. But also how I found that poetry can affect others and how I can affect others through poetry. Perhaps even more effectively in some settings than with essay and fiction. I write fiction and essay, and I still will and continue to and enjoy them. And I love the idea of someone curled with and reading a book of mine, as you do too. It's great stuff, but with a poem you can be right there, and it's a concise, sparkling, the word I'm looking for, lapidary. It's a lapidary. It's like a polished stone between you and the listener. And you can have their attention because they'll give you your attention for a few minutes if you do it well. Poetry read badly, of course, reinforces the opposite view. Now, just last week I was at the Fisher Poets Gathering in Astoria. My girlfriend, Florence Sage, wonderful poet herself, kind of the spirit of poetry in Astoria, Oregon in many ways, was one of the co-founder of Fisher Poets, which is like the Cowboy Poets Gathering in Elko. But it's, everyone who comes to read is involved in commercial fishing in some way or another. And it's working poetry, a lot of it. And a lot of it is rhyming, sing-song poetry, storytelling poetry, a Robert Service type or unsophisticated, a lot of it. But having said that, it will prove you wrong, because when done well, it can be very sophisticated just because it has an iambic set. And the fishermen don't all know how to deliver it as adeptly. So sometimes it's very sing-song, and you just have to go with their story. But others, it has caused a lot of fisher people who come to this thing to read poetry and to read beyond the rhyming story poetry, to read blank free verse. And so some of them are now writing free verse as well. And there's some wonderful poetry there, but all across the range. And I mean, there's a lot of fish, and I don't listen to absolutely everything there. But I come away from it filled. Poetry has a way of filling me and sparking the batteries. I don't know, I just, it's not a cure-all.
No, but it's a tool in your emotional toolkit that's of great importance, right?
That's exactly that, and your writer's toolkit. So after the election, I was as catatonic as anyone. Just disabled. 24 hours, I could barely do my bodily functions. And then the next day I said, I got to do something. And I went walking. Walking is often the antidote to many ills. And realized that this walk was a poem. And came back and put the poem. Very simple poem. But I felt better. Didn't make it better. Trump was still there. The next years are still ahead of us. But it made me realize that there is succor and solace to be had from almost anything in the world. And I always felt that way about nature anyway. That almost anyone's plight can be relieved by close attention to the beauties of the immediate surroundings. Now that's easy to gainsay when you're talking about a person under absolute extremis. Doesn't help much, but most of us can have our lot improved by close attention to the world around us. And it gets us out of our own consuming self-involvement. But the poem offers a medium by which to translate that, to validate it, just like a journal entry. We keep journals to validate our experience, seems to me. I do. And the poem's an elegant way to do it. I love the elegance of poetry. I love the elegance of a poem that's put together well, read well, and then responded to. It just feels very special.
It gives you something of the experience of the performance artist of one type or another, a musician, a dancer, or something. As writers, you know, the happy encounter between our work and our audiences happens in private, in their house, right? And we don't see that very often. But the poet does get to have that experience.
The poet does. It really is. It is performance art, more than necessarily giving a reading of essay or fiction feels. Well, fiction sometimes. But I'm glad you brought that up, because I'm actually having an experience now, which is so strange and so new and so fresh to me that we'd be remiss not to possibly mention it in this interview. And that is that I'm working with a musician on actual performance art. The musician is an unusual person, a real intellect and artist and a fine communitarian by the name of Krist, K-R-I-S-T, Novoselic, N-O-V-O-S-E-L-I-C. Chris grew up in a working class family in Aberdeen, Washington, and Grace Harbor, with his good friend and schoolmate Kurt Cobain. And the two of them founded the band Nirvana, which was the biggest band in the world for about 3 years in terms of record sales and crowds and everything else. And then, of course, finished when Kurt Cobain, who had drug issues, committed suicide. Krist was devastated by this. He'd always been kind of the cement for the band, keeping it together as well as he could. And he didn't leave music, but he more or less left the public eye for a while. And he moved out to the Willapa Hills, and he had bought a 160-acre old farm, one ridge over from mine. Here's the ridge again, a little ridge between Deep River and Grays River. And I had heard about him, that this Nirvana guy had bought this place, and it's adjacent to the 160-acre old growth that we created, so it basically doubled the size of the preserve, and since then he's become the voluntary steward of the preserve. But I didn't bother him. I didn't go to meet him. I heard he had read my book, Wintergreen, and that was one of his reasons for coming out there. Great. But he came to a book signing of mine, and here's this 6'9" guy with interesting clothing, handmade by his wife Darbury, who's 6'3" or 2 maybe. And I said, oh, these must be the Nirvana people, you know. I didn't really know their music at that time. I was a little too old to have picked up on it. And it's harsh music on the ear, some of it. Although, if you actually do listen and attend, Kurt Cobain was a wonderful poet, fine lyricist, and he is actually a melodist. I love good melody in music. And Nirvana music has some gorgeous melodies. You just don't fully appreciate it in the manner in which it was delivered, the punk rock rave. But when you hear Sinead O'Connor singing All Apologies, it is gorgeous. And you see that Kurt was actually a poet and a lyricist and melodist. Anyway, Krist came to my reading. We got to know each other, and we got together on this, that, and the other. And we worked together on some local activism. Resisting the spraying of our county roadsides was one we did together, and worked it out with the county engineer and a few other things. And then he became the master of our Grange. The Grange is the Patrons of Husbandry. It's an old agricultural organization, fraternal organization, that always was gender equal from the 1860s, very unusual in that. And it was an activist organization to protect the farmers. And then it's become, and it's 100 years later, more turgid and conservative and geriatric, but it's still often the only thing going on in a small American town. So Chris realized its radical past and thought it could do good things again, and became the master of our Grange. So weird. And he started our farmers market and lots of other good things. We had a radio program on our community radio station in Astoria, KMUN, where he'd play all kinds of music. But occasionally he would play poetry. Leaves of Grass, read by Orson Welles. And he'd play John Fahey guitar in the background. It was wonderful. So I said, Chris, let's do that at Grange. You play some Fahey-like acoustic guitar. He always brings his acoustic guitar to Grange, not his electric bass. And I'll read some Whitman. And he said, fine, but the heck with that, let's compose our own. This is 5 years ago. And so we did. We composed that poem I began my talk with last night. I wrote the poem, Notes from the Edge of the Known World. He wrote a wonderful guitar song. You can see that one on YouTube. That's the first one that we completed and did that. Well, since then, we've done 12 more. They concern climate change. They concern the tsunami that will take much of the West Coast. They concern the formation of the Northwest landscape by the Brett's floods when the glacial Lake Missoula dams broke and the West flooded and the Columbia Gorge was carved. And lots of other things. There's one about our two rivers and the ridge between them called Two Rivers Song. Some of them are pretty songs. There's one about the swallows coming back. Beautiful. He plays acoustic guitar and he plays accordion on one that is based on John Steinbeck's and Ed Ricketts' Voyage to the Sea of Cortez, log from the Voyage to the Sea of Cortez. And I wrote a narrative poem about it, and he plays an accordion song to that. So we're having such fun, and we've got a third musician working with us for some backup instrumentals. And we're recording, and we're recording with Nirvana's engineer. And this is so weird to me. And so we've gone out and done a few gigs. We performed at the Headwaters Conference, which is a kind of a PILC-like conference that takes place in Gunnison at Western State University every year in Colorado. And we headlined that last year. And there's all these kids there coming to get the Nirvana guy's autograph, and I'm up there on the stage with him. You know. So this is like living everybody's dream of getting to be a rock musician once in your life. And I even get to play my mouth harp on 2 of our numbers. So I'm actually up there playing with the Nirvana guy. So your question about poetry is almost like performance art. It is, and it can be, and it is being that way for me now. And I feel at this stage of my life to be having this weird last chapter. It's such fun. So we're doing an album. It's coming out this year, and then Chris has got a 2-engine plane, and we're going to be flying around doing some gigs.
You remind me of what my sister-in-law said about my late father-in-law, which was that he didn't live to a huge old age, but he was close to 80 when he passed on, and she said, you know, he never got old. He just wore out. I think that's a good ambition to have, don't you?
Yes, it is, and I've been very lucky, and I'm not wearing out yet, and I think the poetry, I think it's good for my health.
Yeah.
I really do. I think my health is enhanced by putting distress into either reading or writing poetry, rather than into the tape loop in my brain, going back and forth and doubling up on the stress by concentrating on it. It doesn't make it go away. It's not a cloud cuckoo land of escape. Nature and literature and music have always been my drugs of choice, so I prefer direct encounter to modified experience. I don't diss it for anybody else. But I just think that bringing in the direct experience of daily encounter, that's one reason I live where I do. It's a rural area, it's not the wilderness, but I can walk outside my door and there are other organisms all the time, from the birds to the snails to the plants. And there's surprise out of doors every single day I go out. And you know, I could be, as some poets are, writing a poem every single day about what's happening. A few too many, nobody's going to listen to them all or read them all. It's like my activism. I try to pick my battles and choose ones where I can make a difference, or I hope I can make a contribution. Same with the poem. I don't write every poem I feel like writing, or every essay, or every story. I'll wait until I feel like there's really a reason for doing this one.
It kind of has to be done.
And it's good for my health, and I think it's going to keep me from wearing out sooner.
Robert Michael Pyle, scientist, author, poet. There's something very special about people like Bob Pyle who really immerse themselves in the natural world and then help the rest of us to understand it and value it properly. We've done some other interviews like that, with Bridget Stutchbury, for example, an expert on songbirds whose work underlies the recent film called The Messenger. And we've had a couple of guests, Gary Saunders and Diana Beresford-Kroger, who have shared fascinating perspectives on the private life of trees. For The Green Interview, I'm Silver Donald Cameron. Thanks for watching.